In this second lesson for the tissue level of organization, we will look at the remaining three tissues: connective tissue, muscular tissue, and nervous tissue, and again finish with consideration of aging and tissue repair. Let's move on to the second group of tissues, which is connective tissue. Now this group is huge, and connective tissue is found everywhere in the body. It is one of the most widely distributed tissues. It has various forms from liquid to solid and therefore has various functions. In general, connective tissue functions in binding, supporting, and strengthening other body tissues. We saw that epithelial tissue is connected to the underlying structures through a layer of connective tissue. Connective tissue protects and insulates. Think of bone connective tissue for protection or adipose connective tissue for insulation. Connective tissue compartmentalizes structures and organizes and separates, such as the connective tissues found within skeletal muscle organs. Connective tissues also form the major transport systems within the body. So blood and lymph are fluid connective tissues. Blood and lymph also provide immune protection. So connective tissue is very much involved in physical as well as immune protection. Connective tissue is the major site of stored energy reserves. So adipose tissue not only provides insulation and cushioning, but also stores energy by housing triglycerides. And as we mentioned, connective tissue is the main site of immune responses. The anatomy of connective tissue is distinct from that of epithelial tissue. Connective tissue consists of two basic elements: cells and extracellular matrix. You will recall that in epithelial tissue, the cells were very simple and they were tightly packed together. In connective tissue, we have a wide variety of cells, some with a higher degree of specialization than others, and the cells tend to be widely spread apart with more extracellular components. The extracellular matrix consists of ground substance and interspersed protein fibers. That ground substance can be fluid, such as the watery component of blood or lymph. It could be semi-solid, such as the ground substance that makes up cartilage or your loose connective tissues like adipose tissue, or it can be mineralized and hard, such as the ground substance of bone tissue. So again, depending on the type of connective tissue, it will have different types of cells and different components to the extracellular matrix. So in the picture below, you can see all different types of cells. And we'll look at each of these on the next few slides. All right, so here we have the types of cells that make up connective tissue. Fibroblasts are large, flat cells with branching processes. These are present in several connective tissues and are usually the most numerous. Fibroblasts are somewhat specialized and they produce an extracellular component protein called collagen. So your fibroblasts are responsible for laying down collagen. Collagen is present in several connective tissues, but collagen is also produced as a component of scar tissue, where connective tissue is formed in areas of tissue damage, especially if the area is large or if it's in a more specialized organ and the tissue that was damaged is non-regenerative, non-proliferative. Fibroblasts will migrate into that area, lay down collagen to kind of fill the gap, but that tissue is non-functional compared to the healthy tissue around it. Fibroblasts, don't forget them. Other tissues have macrophages. Macrophages are specialized white blood cells that develop from monocytes in the blood. And when these monocytes leave the blood and enter the tissues, they differentiate into macrophages, which are large phagocytes. So they engulf debris and pathogens by endocytosis and lead to the destruction of those components. So that's an immune feature found in connective tissue. Plasma cells are another type of cell that produce antibodies and again are another type of immune cell. Mast cells are derived from progenitor cells from which white blood cells come, but mast cells reside in your connective tissues and are essentially your front line, first line cells to stimulate immunity. So they're involved in the inflammatory response. They stimulate the release of histamine, an inflammatory chemical, and they also destroy bacteria. But mast cells are critical for normal immune and inflammatory responses. Adipocytes are abundant in adipose tissue. These are the fat cells that store triglycerides, providing energy storage as well as insulation and protection. So various connective tissues have varying amounts of these basic connective tissue cells, and then various connective tissues have other more specialized cells for that tissue. Here are the extracellular fibers that help to strengthen and support connective tissues. So these are secreted by the cells of the connective tissue and occupy the extracellular space. Three types of fibers are embedded in the extracellular matrix between the cells, and they are collagen fibers, you met those, elastic fibers, and reticular fibers. Collagen fibers are very strong, and the proteins are linked into strands. This allows these fibers to resist pulling forces or provide tensile strength, but they are not stiff, which promotes flexibility. So collagen fibers allow tissues to be stretched to a certain degree, but not overstretched. So they provide tensile strength, but they also allow for movement or flexibility. These fibers often occur in bundles, either arranged in parallel for dense regular connective tissue or in random directions, dense irregular connective tissue. We'll meet those in a few slides. Elastic fibers are a little smaller in diameter than collagen fibers, and they tend to branch and join together to form networks or meshes within a tissue that allow for stretching as well as recoiling to restore shape, size, and position. So elastic fibers allow for stretch and then recoil. Reticular fibers are thin collagen fibers coated with a glycoprotein. So these provide support in a branching type of way and are found in several organs where they almost form the network on which the cells are distributed and form the scaffolding, if you will, for the tissue. So these include the walls of blood vessels, nerves. They're found in skeletal muscles, definitely in the spleen, and in the lymph nodes. Connective tissues are classified into 5 groups. We have loose connective tissue, dense connective tissue, cartilage, bone, and the liquid connective tissues. Let's begin with loose connective tissue. Loose connective tissues tend to have more simple cells and less extracellular matrix. The cells are loosely arranged and the extracellular matrix is semi-fluid. The types of loose connective tissues are areolar connective tissue, adipose tissue, and reticular connective tissue. Areolar connective tissue makes up the top layer of the dermis of the skin, the papillary dermis. It is also found around blood vessels, nerves, and organs. Adipose tissue, as you see, is the one that stores triglycerides and adipocytes. You find adipose tissue in the subcutaneous layer of the skin. So just below the dermis of the skin is a layer of adipose tissue that makes up the subcutaneous or hypodermis layer. There it provides insulation and protection. We also have adipose tissue around the internal organs and also tends to accumulate within the peritoneal folds of the peritoneum of the abdominal pelvic cavity. Again, we have an unlimited capacity to store adipose tissue or to grow adipose tissue and store triglycerides and adipocytes. Reticular connective tissue is the one that is found in the spleen, the lymph nodes, also in the basement membrane, and forms the mesh of the liver where it filters and removes old blood cells and microbes and acts as a supporting network. The cells in loose connective tissue include several immune cells, such as your mast cells, those macrophages, some fibroblasts, and other specialized ones, such as your adipocytes. Let's move on to the next group, dense connective tissue. These have fewer cells, but more extracellular matrix that contains numerous thicker and denser fibers, which are tightly packed together, and again, fewer cells. There are two major types of dense connective tissue, dense regular connective tissue and dense irregular connective tissue. Dense connective tissue is a type that tends to bind and hold structures together. Dense regular connective tissue is made up of several collagen fibers tightly packed in parallel bundles where they provide directionality for applied forces and again tensile strength limiting the amount of stretch. Dense regular connective tissue is avascular. It doesn't have its own blood supply and therefore tends to heal poorly. You find dense regular connective tissue making up ligaments, which attach bone to bone, and tendons, which extend from muscles to attach muscle to bone. And that is very important for the movement that muscle creates across joints as they pull on the bones. We'll see that later. Dense irregular connective tissue, again, has few cells, lots of thick collagen fibers arranged in bundles, but the bundles are randomly arranged. They're not in parallel. And that allows for movement and stretch with limitation in different directions. Dense irregular connective tissue is vascularized, and this is the dominant tissue that makes up the deeper layer of the dermis of the skin. Our next class is cartilage. Cartilage tends to be more solid, of course, than your loose connective tissues. There's a dense network of collagen fibers, as well as some interspersed elastic fibers, and they are firmly embedded in a more rubbery, semi-solid ground substance. Cartilage also contains specialized cells called chondrocytes. And because the extracellular matrix is semi-solid, these chondrocytes are isolated in little cavities called lacunae. Lacunae. So each chondrocyte is housed in a cavity called a lacuna that protect and again isolate the chondrocyte within the ground substance. Cartilage has no blood supply. It is also avascular. So cartilage, believe it or not, tends to heal poorly following an injury. Cartilage is located throughout the body, and there are three types of cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is a cartilage that covers bone ends at joints. So there it reduces friction and provides shock absorption. Hyaline cartilage is also called articular cartilage because it is the cartilage at articulations or joints. Fibrocartilage is cartilage found in specialized joints. For example, the pubic symphysis is the band of cartilage between the two pubic bones of your hip that allow for flexibility of your pelvis, especially during childbirth. Fibrocartilage also makes up the intervertebral discs, which are the joints between the vertebrae. So there, this fibrocartilage provides, what do we have? Flexibility as well as shock absorption. Elastic cartilage is the cartilage found in your ear. That's elastic cartilage. So it's very flexible. So different arrangements of the cartilage allow for different functions. The next class of connective tissue is osseous or bone connective tissue. And this is the main tissue in bones. Now recall, each bone is an organ made up of different tissues. So the main tissue is osseous or bone tissue, but bones also contain adipose tissue, blood tissue, nervous tissue, dense irregular connective tissue, hyaline cartilage connective tissue. So all these different tissues make up the bones, but the main tissue is osseous tissue. Bone tissue has several functions depending on its location. It supports soft tissues. It protects delicate structures such as the bones of your cranium. It works with the skeletal muscles, which attach to the bones made up of the bone tissue, to generate movement at articulations or joints. Bone tissue also stores calcium and phosphorus, as well as some calcium carbonate. Within the cavities of the bone tissue, there is bone marrow. Bone marrow is red when it produces blood cells in a process called hemopoiesis or hematopoiesis. All blood cells are actually formed within bone tissue. Did you know that? Oh, yes. All right. We also have yellow marrow stored in the cavities of bone, and yellow marrow is predominantly adipose tissue, so it's a site for triglyceride storage. So who knew bone was so dynamic and varied in its functions? It's not only for protection and movement, but it also acts as your calcium and phosphorus reservoir and is the site of blood cell production as well as triglyceride storage. So bone tissue not only provides protection but has these other functions. Finally, we have our liquid connective tissues, which include blood and lymph. These have a liquid extracellular matrix with dissolved proteins, and the extracellular matrix, for example, the plasma of the blood, surrounds the cells of the tissue, and the cells of blood tissue are the blood cells, red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, or erythrocytes, leukocytes, and thrombocytes, respectively. Lymph is essentially filtered blood collected from the interstitial fluid, along with cell debris and potentially pathogens that pass through a network system very similar to the veins of the vascular system. And as lymph passes through the lymphatic vessels, the fluid is also filtered through the immune structures called lymph nodes, which contain white blood cells to remove the debris and the pathogens and to elicit immune responses. So we've seen that connective tissues vary from your liquid ones to the very solid ones, bone tissue. This slide summarizes our connective tissue components, including various cells and extracellular components, the fibers, and the ground substance. Please go through it to get just a good idea of the functions and nature of these various components. They mention here eosinophils and neutrophils, which are other types of white blood cells, and because blood is a connective tissue, they're included as connective tissue cells. Good description there of ground substance. We will talk more about the functions of all the white blood cells, mast cells, plasma cells, neutrophils, eosinophils, and macrophages when we get to the lymphatics and immune system chapter. But please go through and just summarize what you can from this slide. So far, we have considered two of the tissue types, epithelial tissue and connective tissue. We will now move on to the third group of tissue, which is muscular tissue. Now, muscular tissue is unique because of the cells and the arrangement of the cells. Muscular tissue consists of somewhat elongated cells. In skeletal muscle, they're called muscle fibers, and they are highly specialized cells, and they are specialized to generate force. So unlike the cells of epithelial tissue and connective tissue, most of which have some regenerative capacity and are less specialized, the cells of muscular tissue are more specialized and have limited capacity for regeneration. Because these cells are specialized to generate force, muscular tissue produces motion, maintains posture, and generates heat as it metabolizes nutrients to create motion. Muscular tissue comes in three types: There's skeletal muscle tissue, cardiac muscle tissue, and smooth muscle tissue, each made up of different types of muscle cells. Skeletal muscle tissue is named for its location. This is the muscle that is attached to the bones of the skeleton. It is also the muscle attached to the skin of the face. By pulling on the bones, skeletal muscle moves the body, or the body parts, and in the face creates facial expressions. Skeletal muscle is also responsible for posture and balance. Now, skeletal muscle tissue is a dominant tissue in your skeletal muscles. So all muscles are organs made up of skeletal muscle tissue, as well as we saw dense connective tissue that makes up the tendons. We have blood tissue that provides oxygen and nutrients to the muscles for energy production. And you have nervous tissue that signals contraction of these skeletal muscle cells. Cardiac muscle tissue, made up of cardiac muscle cells, is only found in the wall of the heart. And their contraction of the muscle tissue generates force to pump blood through the chambers of the heart and into the associated blood vessels. Smooth muscle tissue is located in the walls of hollow internal structures, such as the blood vessels and the airways, where it regulates the diameter of these passageways. Smooth muscle also makes up the walls of the stomach, intestine, gallbladder, urinary bladder. Smooth muscle is also found in the urethra and several of the reproductive structures. Smooth muscle also forms valves called sphincters, the internal sphincters, as well as the sphincters along the digestive tract that regulate the flow from one structure to the next. Now, each of these muscle tissues, again, are made up of different muscle cells. So please use Table 4.2 in your OpenStax textbook to compare the various muscle cells and the tissues they make up with respect to visible lines called striations. Skeletal muscle has striations, cardiac muscle is striated, but smooth muscle is not. And this is based on the arrangement of the proteins that make up the cells and the tissue. Also look at nucleation. Skeletal muscle cells have multiple nuclei because they are actually fusions of several smaller skeletal muscle cells. Cardiac muscle cells tend to be branched and shorter, while smooth muscle cells are spindle-shaped. Compare these three with respect to our nervous control of their activity. We can consciously control skeletal muscle cell activity, but cannot control cardiac and smooth muscle tissue, so those are considered involuntary. And we talked about location and function. Also describe the shape of the cells, as we mentioned, and be able to compare these features for each type of muscle cell and muscle tissue. Note that muscular tissue is also considered excitable tissue because it can respond to and generate electrical impulses. Nervous tissue is our last class of tissue. The nervous system consists of two principal types of cells: the neurons, which are the excitable cells of the nervous system and nervous tissue, similar to your muscle cells. And surrounding the neurons are neuroglial cells, or the neuroglia, supportive cells. Neurons, or nerve cells, are sensitive to various stimuli, so they create responsiveness, and they can convert the stimuli into nerve impulses called electrical signals or action potentials, and conduct these impulses to other neurons or to muscle fibers to stimulate their activity or suppress it, or to glands to regulate secretion. So the neurons are the functional cells of nervous tissue. Neuroglia do not generate or conduct electrical impulses, but they do have many other important supportive functions. As we mentioned, both nervous and muscle tissue are excitable. They can respond to stimuli and generate electrical impulses. Now that was a quick overview of nervous tissue, but you will shortly see that the nervous system is not a simple system. But don't be scared, we'll help you get through it. All right, let's finish up by looking at what happens to our tissues as they are damaged and as we age. Tissue repair is about restoring homeostasis. The main goal of tissue repair is to replace worn out, damaged, or dead cells. Depending on the type of cell that makes up the tissue, new cells originate by cell division from the underlying supportive structure called the stroma, or from the parenchyma, which are the functional, more specific types of cells for each tissue. If parenchymal cells are proliferative and accomplish repair, tissue regeneration is possible, and a near-perfect reconstruction of the injured tissue may occur. You see this with slight scrapes and damage to your epidermis of the skin. However, in tissues that are made up of more specialized cells that are less regenerative, or in cases where the wound or injury is larger, fibroblasts, connective tissue cells, migrate into the area and participate in repair by synthesizing collagen that aggravates to form scar tissue in a process known as fibrosis. So while scar tissue fills in the gap of the wound, the fibrous scar tissue does not perform the function of the parenchymal cells. So the type of cells that make up the tissue and the capacity for regeneration, in addition to the extent and depth of injury, will determine how much homeostasis can be restored in damaged tissues. So tissue repair and regeneration occurs faster and leaves less scars and is more complete in the younger compared to the older. So much so that surgery performed on fetuses in utero, or while baby is still in the womb, actually will leave no scars. The baby will come out like nothing happened. No indication of surgery whatsoever. That, to me, is mind-blowing, especially when in the older population, present company excluded, little nicks and cuts and scrapes leave visible scars. And in those that have more melanin in their skin, scarring also occurs with increased pigmentation. So not only do you have the scar tissue filling in the area, but those areas also tend to be darkly colored. The younger person heals better because they have better nutritional states and better circulation and a blood supply to the regenerating tissue, so better nutritional and oxygen support for cell division and regeneration. They also have a faster metabolic rate, which increases the rate of repair. Other changes that occur with aging include changes to the extracellular components of tissues, such as collagen and elastic fibers, which is very visible in the skin. The breakdown of these extracellular proteins leads to visible signs of aging, such as wrinkles and sagging, and as we saw, scarring and hyperpigmentation. So surgery performed at a younger age usually has better outcomes than surgery performed at advanced ages. All right, we are going to move on to our first official system, the integumentary system, where we will pull many of these concepts together.